Welcome to the Generation F podcast, a podcast where three generations wrestle with faith, asking modern day questions.
Welcome to the show. My name is Isaiah. I am the host of Generation F podcast. I have today with me our co-host Maddie and Phil. Today we are going to talk a little bit about finding time for God or finding time for faith. This is something that I find is really important in today's climate, especially after my last podcast with Jace. There is a clear distinction between the younger generations, mostly, Gen Z and obviously millennials as well, where we're fighting for time to spend to further our faith or understanding. And sometimes we don't understand how do we make time to pursue faith. And this can be something that maybe a lot of people don't necessarily talk about, but I want to have the dialogue today. We're going to break out with our segment first this week, our Between Two Gens segment, just because Maddie has to leave us shortly, and we want to make sure that we get the most out of our time together. So I'm going to ask the question, how does your generation struggle to make time for God or faith? Phil, if you wouldn't mind leading us with that statement, you can take it wherever you'd like, but how did your generation develop habits to pursue faith amongst busy lives and raising a family and all the things growing up?
Yeah. I remember church going or God people early on. It was definitely more the norm. It was definitely something that was culturally acceptable. It was much more than just it was the norm. There was a lot of people that were doing it too, as far as not just church going, but the God thing. And so you weren't fighting against prejudice. You weren't fighting against other things. It's just what everybody did, or most people did. And we were allowed to develop what I'd called faith at the time. And it was faith. It was a faith in God, but I think lacked a few important ingredients. And I think some of those were, Isaiah, you talked about it before, relationship. We were taught about God. We were taught what to do for God and not really how to have a relationship with Jesus and taking that to the next step. So I think our determinations of a good person or a good Christian or somebody that followed God definitely had the definition of I did this for God or I did that for God, so I must be good. And that was one of my experiences. And it lacked that key ingredient of relationship. And I definitely, as I got older, started to see some of the effects of that, where there was not a real closeness. Even in my prayer life, it was tried to follow some patterns there, but it was definitely minus that relationship and the abide that it talks about in the book of John. Abide in me and I'll abide in you. Closeness I didn't have early on, and I think that was some of it was a result of the church and the understanding of faith, what that meant.
Yeah, thank you. Do you feel as if that was caused because of how widespread faith was? The fact that everyone just kind of assumed that you had some kind of religious practice.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Like I said, I can't stress that enough, because it's not like that today. And this is only, 30, 40, 50 years ago only. But it's definitely changed. But then it was the norm. It's what you did. Sunday mornings were devoted to God, and there was other parts of that as well too. But it was definitely the norm. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And Maddie, representing the Gen Z generation, what do you feel were some of your maybe distractions or obstacles, just trying to find time to question religion or just even get into a spiritual practice?
I think a big distraction is, like you said, the technology, specifically social media. I think I struggle with that, and I can imagine that many others who are in my same age group would struggle as well, because we do have this constant technology. The phones are always on us. I guess just like this feeling that you need to share your whole life online, and it makes it hard to be present. I think that's like an entirely different conversation, but as a result of that, it can be really difficult to then be present with God. I mean, I know for myself, if I make my time for prayer in the morning, I know my phone is still blowing up. I'm still getting those vibrations in my pocket, and I'm like, dang, I'm trying to have this moment alone with God, but it can really be distracting. I think maybe another layer that would be interesting to add to it is also that there is, such a change, and I guess the religion that is popularized. And maybe it's not necessarily a religion, but with the new age, there are a lot of discussions amongst my age group about you heal yourself, or the universe, or manifestation. And I think that because of social media, these ideas and concepts are so much more widespread. So even if you did grow up with a faith background, and even if you did grow up going to church with your family, kind of like the way that Phil described, now you have this constant thing that's like, but wait, what about this? Is this what I should be doing? Is God even real? And I think a lot of people come to a conclusion that maybe he's not, and that maybe these new age things are better. And so I think that adds another layer of complexity to it, because most women my age that I would talk to don't believe that there's a God. They might have an atheistic view, or they might believe in other things. And so it can be difficult as well, because there's less cultural, I don't want to say, like, it's pressure isn't the right word, but do you know what I'm trying to say? Like, there's less of like a thing that kind of keeps you on the path, on top of the technology.
Yeah, that's like a really interesting distinction that you said with the pressure, and I think it becomes socially taboo to have, religion, because especially with the millennial and the Gen Z being so intertwined with technology, we are expected to kind of fix everything ourselves, especially coming from our parents being baby boomers or Gen X. We weren't really given the practice of faith. Maybe we were given the practice of religion or tradition, where we were just kind of expected to attend, a church service or do these things around the holidays, but nothing really gave us a sense of ownership over our own faith, where everything was just kind of follow along until we had to question things on our own. And then when we started to question things, we were given these ideas like New Age practice, or just kind of self fulfillments or self progress, where we were expected to just resolve things on our own, or find the meaning of the universe on our own accord. Growing up as a millennial, one of the things that I kind of experienced, I'm almost like this tweener between Gen X and Gen Z, where I was raised in a traditional way, but I also hit technology pretty early. Like, I didn't really have a smartphone until maybe I was out of high school, but I had a phone pretty early on. So there was this idea that there was always this kind of developing distraction. There was things as simple as, video games, or just binge watching television, or doing all these things that created this divide between free time and consuming, right? I feel like we were the generation of consumers, where the Gen Z is the generation of producers, where they wanted to be the influencer, they wanted to produce content and do all these different things, while we were just ravenously watching and obtaining information because we were trying to figure out where we kind of fit in society. Phil, do you have any comments on those?
Yeah, and I don't know. I was just listening to both you talk. There's like one common denominator that I'm hearing, at least from my perspective, my generation too. Always something conspiring to pull us away from a true faith. Always something conspiring to pull us away from what God really desires from us, and that's this relationship. And I think each generation had different nuance to it. Each generation struggled with a different perspective, but the amount that it all came down to, we were all. It was a difficult thing to have the proper perspective on God and faith in God, and it's we've all struggled through that and wrestled through it, and I think that's a good thing. but I think each one of us are coming at it from different perspectives that our generation carried with it too. And I kind of think that's a neat thing. It's like, if God says he's a rewarder of those who seek after him, and he's gonna reward that. And some of that's tied up into our faith too. So I think I kind of see the similarities, even though we're different generations. There's a similarity in the struggle there.
Yeah, I think the similarity is in the distraction, where
Yeah.
maybe in older generations, the distraction was this false sense of security that
Mm-hmm.
you had religion, you had faith,
Yep.
you were traditional, you were conservative, you just kind of did the Christmases and the Easters and checked the boxes.
Yep.
And then as you kind of grow into the other generations, when that dissipates, now the distraction is, okay, well, you don't need any of these things. Here's some new ideas to kind of mull over. Here's the things that are going to take your attention from you. And now you don't have any time to do anything, right?
Yep.
Maybe, for the millennials, and Gen Z really kind of shares the same issue, especially, as they go into the workforce, where most millennials and Gen Z alike are working two jobs, they have side gigs, they have all these things that they have to compete against just to kind of make ends meet. And maybe they don't, maybe they have a good financial standing because they got a great degree, or they have all these other situations that kind of preserved their life. But then they have a lot of distractions in terms of fame, where maybe they're, Insta famous, or they have a YouTube channel, or they have all these things that still kind of combat their full-time attention. Right? When we had the last podcast with Jace, that was a bonus episode. He said something really interesting. He said that the phone raised him. Right? That was something that he said that I really never really thought of, because I grew up with technology, and technology is synonymous with my existence, because I remember my life being technologically intertwined longer than I remember playing outside until it got dark, right? I still have those memories too, but you know, maybe that stopped when I was in middle school or high school, when things started to really kind of rev up technologically. But Maddie, with that same idea of technology raising you, how do you feel that kind of changed your perspective, on reality, and how you would manage time and just kind of allocate time to any type of self-improvement, or even just make enough time to do something as exposing as a spiritual practice like believing in God?
If I think back to when social media first became a thing, it's interesting because I was never really interested in technology before that. I remember, I think in fourth grade, I had gotten an iPod Touch, and that was like the first one where it was digital with the screen. And I remember thinking, what am I supposed to do with this? And so that shows you, where my mindset was at the time. I was focused on being a kid and playing and doing things. And I think that slowly took me away, especially as I got older, especially as I entered the adolescent years. Social media was accessible from this screen. And once that was accessible, once I knew that all my friends were doing that, that's what interested me. And adolescence is such a critical time because usually you are trying to figure out who you are. You're usually trying to fit in with your peers. So just like everybody else, I feel like I got very swept up in that. And I think it drastically altered, how much time I could have spent on things that were more fulfilling, including a spiritual journey. At some point around that age as well, my family stopped going to church together, so I didn't have that spiritual support anymore. And I mean, looking back now, I can kind of see how things just went downhill from there. I think that the external support, would have been very helpful, but I didn't really have any faith role models in my life at the time. And so it kind of just led me down a negative path, I would say.
And that was kind of the angle that I was going, towards, is just, again, the separation between distractions, where, especially in the older generations, I feel like there was this large false sense of security and faith, where everything was just, hunky-dory because of the American dream and all these different things that permeated that spiritually or just traditionally. And then as we kind of go into these younger generations, more so with Gen Z millennial bridge, maybe those 96ers or people that are born in the early 2000s, where it's they just maybe had time to not have technology, but then when it came through, it kind of swept them away because, like Maddie said earlier, with the social media aspect, the next thing you know, it's very revealing to put yourself out there, and it almost creates this self censorship to faith where, okay, if my peers see what I'm eating, if I'm at a cafe or a restaurant or whatever, because we were kind of indoctrinated to create this voyeuristic experience for everyone to kind of see what's going on. The last thing you want to know is someone's faith practice. Even being a boomer or Gen X, it was very difficult for my parents to walk around and be questioned about their faith, even though most people would not have too much of an issue, but it was still a very revealing part of their experience. Like, how do you stand up for your faith? And then when you go into these younger generations, again, that word self-censorship comes in to where now I'm getting conditioned to tell the world everything that I do. And now the last thing I want to do is show them something that I feel like they're going to disagree upon. So therefore, I'm not going to create any time for it. And Phil, do you have any comments on that, since that's probably pretty new to you?
Yeah, it is. It is new. The notion of that, as you were talking, it was more of a question. Um, the understanding of a real, lasting faith that is relational in nature. What's the biggest roadblock to that? Is it ourselves? Is it our own nature? Sometimes we're stupid past the point of understanding. So we do stupid stuff that's not helpful to that, or is it outside influence? Is it Satan working against us to conspire and weaken our faith? And I think some of that, I don't know. I'd just be interested in hearing your thoughts on that too. There's two sides to it. The one that we bring to the table ourselves, and then also the outside, the spiritual forces that are working against us too. But what's the bigger obstacle to real time faith?
That is a tough question to answer. I definitely would be curious to hear Isaiah's thoughts on this because he has, much more experience than I do. But what I will say is maybe it's a little bit of both. Maybe it's a lot of both. I don't know that there's maybe one more than the other. I think our flawed human nature contributes to that. Like, of course, it's the same thing as we want to take better care of our health, and getting ourselves to do that one little task that would make such a big difference it's so difficult. We know it's easy. We know it's not hard to set aside the 5 or 10 minutes or an hour, but to get ourselves to actually do it feels so difficult. And I think that's just natural resistance we have. For some reason, us humans seem to have a natural resistance towards doing things that are good for us. I don't know why that is. And then, along with, the enemy, I feel like it's pretty apparent that he's at work, and he's constantly at work, and in different ways for different generations. He almost like molds and shapes the distractions to be suited to the person and the generations that we are in. And so maybe for you, Phil, it was like Isaiah said, just kind of like this feeling that maybe something was missing, and maybe those practices that you grew up with were less important. And for our generation, I really do feel like, at least for me, it's definitely a technological thing, and perhaps that's a reason why. But it's definitely hard to say if it's one or the other. I could say, though, what Isaiah had mentioned about social media and being afraid to stand up for Christ, to speak about your belief in Him. It is a very real thing that I have definitely experienced intense fear about. In fact, that's like what a large part of me getting back into my faith felt like. It was fearfulness about sharing that with people because I didn't know how it'd be received, as if that's something that's, super important. It's really not. It's the religion, it's the relationship I have with God and what that's done in my life, what that will do for others' lives. But it feels so intense and scary, and almost something that would have held me back given the age of social media and technology.
Yeah.
So that could be the enemy at work. I don't know.
Just to kind of pair with Maddie's comment, I think of this word, zeitgeist, right? The word zeitgeist comes from this German philosopher in the 1800s, and it basically translates to the spirit of the age, right? So we think of that word, it's kind of used in like a cultural context to every generation having like a certain essence or a certain spirit, right? So I see that a lot of times every generation has like their own obstacle, but it's very specific to their timeline, their time period, right? And to just kind of answer that question, we have to kind of understand that there is an opposition, there is an enemy, whether you choose to call a name to it or just understand it as what it is. There is something that is conspiring against your ability to have faith. But I really liked what Maddie said, where it's a little bit of both, right? There is a little bit of both in the sense that we have a very specific physical human nature. I see it very similar to in my job where I'm training people, I'm coaching athletes, where there's this tendency to maybe want change but not want to do the things that's required of it. Or there's this, I don't want to say like laziness, but there's this mentality when doing something that's inherently good for you, your body and your psychology almost kind of works against you to some degree, right? And I think when you pair that with the idea of an opposition, whether it be societal or technological or spiritual, they almost like exacerbate the human nature that we already have, right? It's like the saying that you'll hear sometimes in podcasts, never let a crisis go to waste, where whenever there's something that happens in the world, whether it was orchestrated or natural an occurrence, capitalize on it, right? So I think that the opposition has a lot of that as well, where if there's an inherent crisis within your own ability to do something good for yourself, like to have a spiritual or faith practice, there's going to be obstacles, right? There's going to be things that are going to kind of come in the way, because why would the opposition allow the offensive to take over, right? Why would you let the opposing team score on you, right? So I think that's a really good thought-provoking segment to where maybe we can start to kind of answer these questions with the scripture, right? Which I always like to lead with. I don't want to be an opinion-based podcast, so we do want to kind of look towards the scripture to kind of see if we can justify our opinions or just kind of work through it. So what I do have here in the New Testament, we're going to turn to the book of Mark. It's going to be Mark 12. So we have Mark 12, and this is a very small segment. It's actually going to be in verses 41 through 44. The title of it's called The Widow's Offering. So just to kind of give context, Jesus is sitting near the temple, right? And he's watching two situations happen. He's watching, the Pharisees or the people within the temple that have all the power and the wealth donating to the temple or the church, right? So he's analyzing this situation alongside with someone who is a widow. Her husband died and she has no money. She doesn't have the means to give much of anything, right? So it says here in verse 41, Jesus sat near the temple money box where people put their gifts. He watched the people put in their money. Many rich people gave large sums of money. Then a poor widow came and gave 2 very small copper coins. These coins were not worth even a penny. Jesus called his followers to him. He said, I tell you the truth. This poor widow gave only 2 small coins, but she really gave more than all those rich people. The rich have plenty. They gave only what they did not need. This woman is very poor, but she gave all she had, and she needed that money to help her live. So just to kind of take this 4 verses, and we can go in a lot of different directions, but one of the things that I kind of want to highlight, talk about, discuss is what are our 2 copper coins, right? There's this notion that when I grew up in the church, one of the many things that I would hear, regardless if it was within a denomination or just somewhere else, even Catholic school to some degree, is they would always say to, give your whole entire life to Jesus, right? And that was pretty stressful for me to think about at a very young age, because I didn't understand the context, and I rejected the notion of having to give up everything that I planned for myself. Already kind of creates a large barrier for people to go through faith, is because they're mulling over the things that they want to control. They have these riches in their life that they're maybe donating in essence, where they're trying to do good, they're trying to help the needy, they're trying to do these little things out of the abundance that they already have, but there's a position of their heart that they're not willing to give up, right? And one of the things that I really love about this scripture is it becomes very encouraging to this generation, to the millennial, to the Gen Z, to the Gen Alpha, because one of the things that Jesus truly wants is our heart, but it's also our heart in the position of what we give. So whenever we have context to something, it's not the physical heart that pumps blood. It's the idea that when we give something to God, even if it's a few minutes of praying or praying before a meal, driving to work and listening to a podcast, doing these very small things out of the stress of your day, all within all of the difficulties and the obstacles that you have in your life, that does kind of become those two pennies. And Phil, one of the things that I want to talk about is, how does this scripture appeal to that idea of just kind of giving our time, and how does this kind of lead into the idea of growth in faith?
I think it plays wonderfully because it is a process. I liked what you said at the beginning about the very thing, because it's not an all at once type of thing where we don't grow instantly into this mature person of faith. It's a process. We all come under that training and the instruction, and it's hard. And for me personally, one of the most difficult things was coming to the understanding that God has my best interests at heart, that he loves me that much, that even though for me it may seem a difficult thing that I'm going through, that he's part of it. He's using it for not just his good, but my good as well, too. He's pruning away, taking away some of those things in my life that are not bearing fruit, that are not good. And he's building something that's far better. Coming to that understanding for me it was tough. You know what I mean? Because I think just innate human nature, we hold on to things that, okay, I'm gonna do this for God, and it's not really gonna cost me much. And then we find out, okay, I was safe there. Next time I'm gonna give a little bit more. I found my experience was there's always a part that you withhold from God, whether it's through safety or past hurt. We don't want to be hurt there again. That we withhold that from God. And God, for me personally, I can speak out this. He just took it. He just said, okay, that is mine. Over the course of years, now I look back and it's like he had my best interest, but I was withholding that part of myself because I didn't want to be hurt again. And he just said, I got that. I have that. And we're going to walk through this together. It was a difficult walk, but it definitely deepened my faith. It was a relational thing where I not only felt his love, but I felt that he had my best interest at heart.
Yeah, thank you. And one of the things that I really want to kind of dive into even deeper is the notion of time, right? So we have this idea of the widow giving more than time. It was probably her last 2 cents that she had. It was everything that she had to give. But within today's climate, with time being such a commodity, and most people, they work sun up to sundown, they come home, they have to take care of their spouse or their partner, and they have all these obligations. Most of the people that I talk to, they get home from work and they have to do more work, right? They have to do admin stuff, they have to answer emails, they have to plan for the next day, they have to cook for their kids, cook for their family. Time is just scarce, right? It's non-existent to some degree, where the days seem shorter and time just kind of runs together because it's so chaotic and saturated with obligations and distractions. And I find a lot of times when we do have any of free time, what do? We kind of latch on to the easy enjoyments, the social media, the YouTube, the television. But with that nature of time being taken from us by the things that we give attention to, how can we apply this idea of giving these 2 pennies to God? How can we apply this idea of giving what we do have to give to establish a momentum to have a faith practice?
Again, personally, I can tell you that it looked more like a fist fight with God than it did obedience. I fought him on many levels, for that last little bit. And some of it was selfishness. Some of it was just me not wanting to give over full authority to get to God. And Isaiah, I'm going back to the scripture that you read there. When she gave those 2 cents, his words, Jesus' words, she gave out of her poverty. And I think there's something to that for me when I'm thinking about it now. It's like giving out of our hurt, giving out of the things that we're not good at. I think it's easier for us to give of those areas and things that we possess a lot of, where it's a talent of working with people or money. If you possess a lot of money, not a hard give. When you don't have skill and talent in a certain area, you don't have time in a certain area. You're a young mother, you've got several children, time becomes compressed and you don't have a whole lot of time. And I think those are the areas that God is trying to prove into us to give from, the ones that we struggle with the most, so that it's not us giving. It's really not. And he takes the little that we can give and just multiplies it.
Yeah, that was more in line with the point that I wanted to come across, is this nature that the most valuable thing that we have in life is time. It's non-renewable, at least in this physical realm. So having time determines if you're poor or rich, at least in the idea of time being valuable. So the more time that we have, the more wealth that we have. The less time that we have, the more that we appear impoverished. With that idea, in my perspective, I see most people that exist in a world that have no time to give, they are impoverished, right? They are impoverished because they don't have enough time to give to their spouse, to their family, to their neighbor. They're squeezed and constrained in every aspect of their life to not be able to breathe or to experience any type of rest, right? I can kind of speak from experience in the sense that my days are very busy. And some days it's very difficult for me to set time for God. And that is full transparency. It's difficult for me to carve out time to read and to pray. But I always think back to the scripture. I ask my God, what 2 pennies can I give you today? Sometimes I'll make a choice. I'll make a choice when I'm walking to work, because in one of my jobs, I have the ability to walk to work where I live. And I'll tell God, I'm like, God, I'm going to walk with you to work. I'm not going to listen to a podcast. I'm not going to listen to music. I'm going to walk and talk with you, because yes, I'm going to work, and yes, I'm going to have a long day, but I'm giving you my 2 pennies. I'm giving you what I can. And then when I have a meal, I ask the Lord to bless it, to give me strength to do the things that I need to do. And I create these habits that allow me to make time in the poverty of time that I have to give, in terms of not having a lot. And why I really love this scripture as an encouragement, it's very similar to when I have a client that doesn't have time for fitness. They don't have time for health. They don't have time to meal prep. They don't have time to do these important things that would establish a healthy lifestyle. But my job is to give them one thing to do and make sure that they master that before momentum comes and they can do 2 things. So when I talk to someone and I say, hey, listen, everyone that you see around you, they might be going to the gym multiple times a week, but I want you to do once. Can you do once? For some people, that might be church, that might be a Bible study, that might be reading. Can you do it once, right? Can you go on a walk. I'll tell people all the time, walking is the best thing for you. Can you go on a walk with God? Can you just walk down the street, around the block, maybe walking your dog, and try and talk to God? And I had Jace on the other episode, and one of the things that I always tell Jace when I would talk to him, as a friend in our outings, is if you don't know how to pray to God, talk to Him like He's your friend. Start there. Eventually the language and the structure might change because it's practice, and you learn how to do things based off of what you read in the Bible, how to phrase certain things or how to organize thoughts. But start just talking to Him like He's your friend, like He's your father, right? Start there. Even if it's wrong, it's right, because you have a place to start with, and then that will potentiate the next step. So when I come from that background where I rejected the idea of faith because I felt like I couldn't give it all, right? I couldn't, give Jesus my whole life because I valued my life too much. And I want to encourage and challenge someone to think, well, can you give him one thing? What's the one thing that you can give? And I think with our human nature, as we start to understand the benefit of that one thing being given, then we start to want to give another thing, right? It's just like going to the gym again. You do one workout and you feel good, then you want another one, right? And you come back to the next week, and that starts to kind of potentiate momentum. Phil, do you have any comments on that idea?
No,
there?
I like that. It is momentum, isn't it? I mean, it's definitely something that you can feel that God is working, and it definitely is self-fulfilling. You just keep taking steps towards God. It's as simple as that. Yeah, I like that.
Yeah, I used to have this mentor who would always say, it's not how much you do something, it's how you apply it, right? And especially when we're talking about the Bible, some people might just read a devotional. That might be the best starting place for some people, where they just buy a devotional at the dollar store and they just kind of read a page a day. But it's what you do with that one verse that's going to determine if your life actually starts to change or not. When I first started getting back into faith, I did the complete opposite. I would binge read the Bible over and over and over again. And it was like drinking through a fire hose, And I think much like human nature, where we feel that we have to do something in abundance to get somewhere faster, that's what I did, right? I thought, well, if I study the Bible and read it every single day, and I have an audio Bible playing in the background when I'm at work, and I'm just listening to it over and over and over again, I'm going to ascend to this holy mountain, right?
Good luck with that.
Yeah. And it's funny because, I learned a lot of things, but I created more questions than answers because I didn't spend time applying things. I didn't spend time seeing how these things changed my mind and my life. And one of the biggest things that I learned from these mentors that I had, they would say, hey, I want you to read one verse a day and just read it over and over again. Read it over and over again until you understand it. And if you don't understand it, look it up. And if you don't understand what you're looking up, look that thing up. Just keep on being so specific with that one sentence until it just kind of makes sense. And then you move on to the next verse and then the next verse. And I remember I did that with one of the smaller books. It may have been like James or Ephesians. And I remember doing that for a summer where I literally went verse by verse every day. And I got so much more out of that little bit of, digesting of information than I have in my whole entire life of reading the Bible, cover to cover. So that's something that I find very important with the nature of giving God that little bit of time, that heart posture, like that intention. It's really intention. Like, what is your intention with this information? How are you going to apply it to your life? And that's going to have more return of your investment going forward, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So we're going to go on to this last scripture that I have prepared. And one of the things, it's really going to kind of tie in what we just kind of said. It's in the book of Corinthians. So it's Corinthians 1, chapter 9. And again, it's a few verses. This is Paul writing to the church in Corinth. 1 Corinthians chapter 9, starting in verse 24. I'm going to read it through and we're going to talk about it. It says, "You know that in a race, all the runners run, but only one gets the prize. So run like that. Run to win. All of those who compete in the games use strict training. They do this so that they can win a crown. That crown is an earthly thing that lasts only a short time, but our crown will continue forever. So I do not run without a goal. I fight like a boxer who is hitting something, not just the air. It is my own body that I hit. I make it my slave or my servant. I do this so that I myself will not be rejected after I have preached to others." When we kind of look at this few verses, there's a few things that you can kind of take with this, but one of the biggest things that I want to tie into this idea is of training. Whenever we have an event or a sport or a goal, whether it be to be healthier, to lose weight, to run a 5K, to do something more sports organized, there's a starting point where you know nothing. There's a point to where you're learning the basics, and maybe you're going to one practice or you're going on one run. You're doing the very bare minimum to learn the skill, to fail, to learn how to succeed, to see how you can navigate this obstacle. And then again, as momentum kind of grows, you start to become an athlete, right? You start to only think about that sport. You start to only think about this activity day and night. You train 4 days a week, 5 days a week, whatever, and it becomes your everything. You know, in the sport that I coach, you know, sometimes I have people that start once a week and twice a week, and next thing you know, they're ready to sell their house to become like a professional athlete because they're so obsessed with it, right? And that is the connecting piece, the bridge to our faith, where we are called to give our life to Jesus, but that is the end goal, right? The end goal is to let him have control over everything. The first step is that first practice, is that first day of training. Like, what is the one thing that you can practice towards to get to the finish line of that race, to get to that end goal, to get that medal? And I think that's, again, I love using the word encouraging, because when I was younger and I would read these words and I would just think so negatively towards it. I would think, oh my gosh, I have to give everything up. I have to sell my house. I can't go to college. I can't do this. I got to be a missionary. I have to do X, Y, and Z. But I missed the mark. I didn't understand what God was trying to really say. You know, he wanted to control and provide for my life. Not just to control, but to provide. To, like you said earlier, to give the best things to you. But in order for that to happen, I need to start to give things up in that process. And it started small. It started with, honestly, listening to a podcast back in 2021, where I would just listen to a podcast at work. And then it just started to grow from there. You know, so Phil, what are some things that you think about in regards to that scripture, but the idea of training and developing faith versus just saying that we have to do everything all at once?
I loved sports too when I was younger, loved to play them, but it was more like an outlet. It wasn't anything that I would say that I was disciplined in or good in. When you read those verses, the word that kept coming back to me was discipline. You know, we are going to start out small, but the discipline for me was just an end goal. And the end goal was just to be, when it comes to faith matters, to be closer to God, you know, and that allows you, I think, to get through some of the hard practices, to get through some of the hard days, you know, when you just don't feel like spending time, or you know, you're tired, or whatever the reason is. There's that end goal that says, you really said this and you're living it out, that you want to be closer to me. Let's keep going. And it almost feels like God was pulling me along in some of those in the days that I didn't want to, and the discipline started to grow. I liked your piece there at the beginning, Isaiah, when you said you start small. You really have to. It's not the fire hose mentality where we can just open wide and he's going to pour everything in all at once. We learn in small increments. That definitely resonated with me there. But the discipline to stay with it and to keep building off those small pieces where he just kept pulling me all along.
Yeah, this is more of a question for you.
Okay.
Do you agree with that idea? Or, again, this could be generational too.
Okay.
I feel as if growing up around boomers within church services and groups and functions, you name it, one of the biggest things that I would always hear is this nature of just kind of complete surrender, and I feel like so much onus was put on those words, and no one ever really talked about first steps.
Yeah.
There was this almost over focus on just completely changing everything,
Right.
and having this almost supernatural or radical experience that would allow you to do that task, right? Maybe it was this supernatural godlike experience that you're like, okay, yeah, I'm gonna give it all up to him. I'm gonna be a missionary. I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna donate all my stuff. Like, do you feel that came from a very specific place within your generation, or was that more of like an interpretation, or am I wrong?
I think it's more of an interpretation, because my experience when I first started out in the church definitely mimicked that. It started out with, well, here's what the great heroes of the faith did. You'd hear scripture, you'd hear stories. David. They here's what giving all looks like. But my experience was we were provided steps to increase and start to follow God. So that part I would say not, I not necessarily agree with you there. That was my experience, but generationally that was definitely a big part of it where it was more like a system that just produced believers, or quote believers, as opposed to real genuine faith. And sometimes the reliance on the supernatural, God's going to come down and just all of a sudden, boom, I'm going to be who he wants me to be. That was definitely part of the day as well too. It wasn't necessarily my experience, but it was definitely there.
Yeah, and again, I'm sure there's context to the time period and the situation. And I find being a millennial and just being surrounded by Gen Z, Gen Alpha, it almost feels impossible to do that now, right? Where it's physically impossible to do that. But then sometimes I'll go on YouTube and I'll see some kind of street evangelist or someone who's just doing a lot of really crazy stuff in communities, and I'm like, oh, okay, well, maybe that's what I'm supposed to do, right? So you start to get almost like this imposter syndrome with your own faith, where you start to feel as if you're creating a barrier on your own to have growth. But I think the biggest thing that I maybe not necessarily want to communicate, but create is a lack of an obstruction to come to the table, right? Where it's, there's so many reasons to not have faith in your life, whether it's social rejection on social media, by your peers, by your family, by your friends, even before you even have the idea of trying to do it or trying to say a prayer or trying to read the Bible. There's already a stigma that's controlled, throughout society that would prevent you from even coming at the table, right? So my stance comes from the nature of creating less barriers for entry versus making it seem almost unattainable. And I don't know if I'm right by doing that, but it's just kind of how I see things.
I just think by nature, the very pursuit of God is something that we're never going to do in our own. We're never going to attain to perfection. We're never going to attain to spiritual discipline that totally puts God at the center. We're just not. But Paul says we're still supposed to run that way to beat our body. That's good advice for anybody starting out. You know what I mean? That kind of sets the course. This is what the goal is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, again, I'm not trying to be prescriptive and tell people how to do it. And some people do give everything over immediately and then they have a great life. I mean, and I don't think that should be a deterrent for someone to do that if they're called to do that. But I think we're living in such an age that there's so much competing for our attention. There's so much competing for our time. You know, time almost seems like it's always running out. And the idea of faith being such a long process, most people will just have the mentality to not even attempt it. Versus having the idea of, you know, what is the one thing that I can give up this week? What is the one thing that I can try and do to get closer to the idea of following God or knowing who Jesus is? You know, God doesn't ask us to start at the finish line. You know, he wants us to be faithful with the time that we have today. So I want, in just general closing, to encourage the audience to process this information and, you know, question it in their own ways, but also just kind of see, hey, what is that one thing I can do? What are those 2 pennies that I can give for today? And maybe see if it grows into something more valuable. I want to thank you guys for listening to this podcast. You know, we do plan to release episodes once a week with the occasional bonus interview episode. We will see you guys throughout the week. And please also follow us on Instagram at Generation F Pod. We are also on YouTube with the same name. And we're also found on Apple Podcast with generationfpod@gmail.com with any questions or comments. Thank you so much and have a good night.
Different generations, same questions, Generation F.